Hello, everyone. Welcome to Veteran Voices. I'm your host, Mary Kate Soliva. Welcome back to those of you who have joined us before, and hello to those of you out there who are joining us for the first time. Veteran Voices is part of the Supply Chain Now family of podcast programming, and it is a podcast where I love to interview veterans who are serving beyond the uniform. I'm a veteran myself, and we have an incredible guest today. I'm excited to introduce to you all, but just a quick programming note before we get started. Veteran Voices, you can get it wherever you get your podcast from. And we are in proud partnership with the Guam Human Rights Initiative, a nonprofit that is near and dear to my heart. And you can learn more about how this incredible nonprofit is advancing research on human rights issues impacting Guam and the region at www.guamhri.org. And again, we have a special guest today, Marine Corps veteran, and he is out in Minnesota, and we are excited to welcome to the show Ralph Asher. Ralph, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on, Mary Kate.
Yeah, I would love, we had a chance to speak before, but I'm so glad that you're able to join us to get on Veteran Voices. I know you wear many hats, and you've been just a huge advocate and proponent to helping veterans in the veteran community. And so I'm really grateful to have you on the show. As you know, I love to kick off Veteran Voices with a motivational quote. Cadence, singing is welcomed, but please share with us your favorite motivational quote.
Yeah, well, thank you. So one of the principles that guide my life is that I know a little bit about a lot of things. I know a decent amount, but there's a whole lot more that I don't know than what I do know. And so the best way to expand my knowledge base and to learn about new things and learn more deeply about reading and learning from others. So the quote I'd like to share is from James Mattis, retired Marine General, former Secretary of Defense. And this is a letter that he wrote to his staff in 2003. And it goes, "The problem with being too busy to read is that you learn by experience or by your men's experience. That is the hard way. By reading, you learn through others' experiences, which is generally a better way to do business, especially in our line of work where the consequences of failure are so bad for young men." Uh, and it goes on about talking about how he has basically never experienced something where he has not had a guidance from others by his reading. So I found that to be really motivational and really encouraging as I try to develop as a person and professionally.
That's a fantastic quote. And so I guess I do have to ask, do you have a sort of a reading list that you try to hit every year?
Nothing that I try to hit routinely, but there's a number of subjects that I like to look into both on a professional basis and a personal basis. And when I see something new about that, then I tend to put that on the list.
Oh, I love that. And I was fortunate enough to meet General Mattis just a couple of years ago. And again, just having a legend such as himself to stand in front of you, but at the same time also being able to share such knowledge and wisdom with us was really just an incredible experience. So thank you for sharing that great quote from General Mattis. And again, that is something that I need to heed, as I also do not have necessarily a checklist of books that I read in the year, but I know it is valuable, important information. So I would love to segue, Ralph, into where you grew up. I know we touched on it a little bit when we first spoke, but would love to share with our audience a bit about your upbringing.
Yeah, so I grew up in the state of Indiana, in the northwest part of the state. I would say, if you ask me what town, the town is called Valparaiso, Indiana, but I actually grew up about 10 miles outside of it, in a place where we actually didn't have a street name. It was just called 300 South. Like it was just a
No
mile,
way.
3 mile song where the streets have no names. That's where I grew up in Indiana, uh, and had a great upbringing. My mother and father were amazing parents. I have three older sisters, and ended up. We'll probably talk a little more about how I got into the Marine Corps, but ended up going to college there in my hometown, and went to Valparaiso University, and then ended up. So I lived in Northwest Indiana until basically I commissioned in the Marine Corps and started active duty.
Hey, you talked about having your older sisters. What was that like, being the little brother in a
It
house of
was
girls?
it had it had its good and its bad things. My sisters were very protective of me and are great great sisters and siblings as an adult. And my oldest sister actually started her own business when I was a teenager. And so it's kind of when I transitioning eventually into entrepreneurship, she was a great example and great source of advice for as I was thinking about doing that.
No, I think that's fantastic. I actually wonder because I know I'm going to ask, in a moment here about your any influences that you had around you with regards to the military, but particularly for my Marine Corps guests, I always wonder of a branch that is notorious for being, physically demanding and very strict. Why the Marine Corps, unlike other branches of service, but I feel like now it makes sense that you grew up with older sisters, and I feel like they prepared you to enter the Marine Corps. But did you have any sort of influences in the military? You talked about that one road where there are billboards, recruiters walking around. What was that like?
Yeah, so essentially, how it happened was so I have a family tradition of military service. My father was in the Army. He was enlisted in the Army, and my grandfather was enlisted in the Navy in World War II. And so I graduated high school in 2002. So, 9/11 had just happened. So thinking about, hey, how am I going to participate in this and kind of heed my nation's call in this generation? That was um, so I actually got steered towards the Marines in a couple of ways. So first off, when I was in high school, I saw a documentary about the different service academies and Air Force, and didn't seem all that great. But neither did the Coast Guard. But the Army one, the West Point seemed pretty awesome because they did what looked like some pretty cool field training as cadets, I suppose, would be their title. And then the Naval Academy one, when the section of the document on the Naval Academy, it was a mixed bag for me because apparently the midshipmen had to swim a very long time as a graduation requirement, and as somebody that could barely swim at all, that seemed very discouraging to me. Uh, but they also showed a lot of the midshipmen doing field training with the Marines, because a lot of Marine officers come out of the Naval Academy. I thought, huh, Marine Corps, that seems pretty cool. Uh, and so I thought about that route, doing the military academy route, but ended up going to college in my hometown. Um, Sophomore year, I began to think, hey, maybe I made a mistake, right, doing the civilian college thing. So I started kind of looking on the academy's websites and said, okay, now can you apply as somebody who's already in a regular college? And then just by chance, I was in my college library where all future warriors are to be found, and saw a poster with the business card from what's called the Officer Selection Officer for the Marine Corps, which is essentially the officers who's in charge for recruiting future lieutenants. And so I thought, huh, maybe this is fate, right? So I email the captain. He was stationed up in Chicago, so it was about an hour away. I emailed him, said, hey, I have some questions. I've thought about this for a while. Can you tell me some information about that? And the die was kind of cast at that point. He came down a week later, and within probably a month, I was selected to go to Officer Candidate School the next summer. So,
So I was wondering because I was kind of like on the edge of the seat because I was like, did you end up going to the academy? Because I know they do take sort of prior service and those a little bit older too. So it's interesting you ended up going the officer candidate route and that there was a poster. Again, it's like they were like subliminal messaging or just like random catchy catchphrases, the few, the proud, the Marines. But again, it's with talking about that and seeing that in a library, I think is really interesting. That
yes,
was the
and
route that you took. And not
well,
the Air Force. Oh gosh.
uh, and there was actually an Air Force ROTC detachment on my college, which was a very small college, but yeah, I ended up going Marines, and I eventually later on was on recruiting duty, and I realized how poorly performing posters really are as a recruiting aid. So the fact that I was brought in by one, I think, was even more unlikely.
Well, I was trying to think because I was like, I drive down the road and see Marine Corps billboards all the time, and I feel like if you were to just survey random populace about quotes like catchy slogans that they know for recruitment. I think the Marines would be one of them, the Army, but I'm not sure about the Air Force, like you said, or even the Coast Guard. Not off the top of my mind. So, but no, I think that that was a great choice. And as I say, you've definitely reaped the rewards since your Marine Corps career. And I'd just love to, to sort of segue into that. So now you've gone through officer candidate school. And you like to share a little bit about what that process was like? Especially, did you end up going in there a bit like a couple years head start early later than some of your colleagues, your peers?
Yeah, it's a great question. So without going into a tremendous amount of detail, and I'm sure a lot of this detail is not accurate anymore because looking at the clock on my computer, that was literally 20 years ago. Um, but
Yourself.
yeah, God, apparently I'm middle-aged now. So there's two options for current college students who wish to become Marine officers and academy. So one is what's called the platoon leaders course, and the other is called the officer candidates course. And essentially, it's dependent upon where are you in college, in terms of what year you are, and or are you graduated. So, like me, I was in the fall of my sophomore year of college when I first contacted the OSO,
Hmm.
and because I had basically two more summers left before graduation, there's a program called the Platoon Leaders Course, juniors and seniors, where you do 6 weeks of OCS after your sophomore year, and then 6 weeks after your junior year. And then once you've completed that second one, then you graduate college the next spring and you commission. So that was just by the timing of when I contacted them, that was the program I went into. Uh, and OCS was like the best of times. It was the worst of times. Like there was, I love to run. And so the fact that we did a lot of running was, great. I'm like, okay, this seems pretty intuitive. Didn't was a terrible at drill, still am. So that's something that was a struggle for me. I had never, in that point in my life, had that much riding on my ability to climb a rope. And
That's
since
hilarious.
then,
How was the
not as
swimming?
been important. Uh,
Did you have to swim? Did you still have to swim much? Being in the
yeah, yeah. So with the Marine Corps, at least with the in recruit training, you do swim qualifications in recruit training, but
Mhm.
with the officer
I call it
pipeline,
near drowning training, for those who
yeah,
have not served.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
not a
It was
leisurely
definitely
swim.
no, it's definitely not an afternoon at the pool. But with the mission of officer candidate school is basically to see, do you have the raw materials to serve as a Marine lieutenant,
Mm,
right? It's not to really train you. And so swim qual and a lot of other things like rifle qual, that doesn't come until after you've commissioned and you go into further training. So
interesting.
eventually managed to this swim qual, but it was after I was already a lieutenant.
And you're like, I will stick to running. I actually think it's, and why I wanted to linger here a little bit is because when when our country's in a time of peace, so to speak, right? When training, it's easy to think like I'm gonna go through this, I'm gonna go through this suck because I want free college and I want job stability. But like, not to date yourself again, but you talked about graduating high school in 2002. So we're talking about like we're literally at the height of the war. So like going into that. So you were training with the knowledge of knowing that very likely that you would go, report to your first U station and essentially end up deploying at some point. So what was going on at that time, the thought process there throughout your time in the program?
Yeah, my thought process was I want to be part of this. Like my
Mm,
country needs the service of young men and young women who want to answer that call, and I want to answer that call. That was the thought process.
mm,
Yeah, because when I first talked to my OSO, that was the fall of 2003,
mm-hmm,
and the Iraq War had begun in spring of 2003. So at that point, it was the Marine Corps as an organization was heavily engaged in Iraq, less so in Afghanistan at that point. But
mm,
I wanted to be part of it, and so I commissioned in May of 2006 and went to what's called the basic school, which for Marine officers is a 6 month long training evolution where you learn the fundamentals of being a rifle platoon commander. So
Mm.
I can't speak to other services, but the Marine Corps, really emphasizes the common training of all Marine officers, like whether you're going to be an infantry officer or a pilot or a lawyer or a logistician, or like me, I was a communications officer. Like everybody is going through this 6 month training where you learn the fundamentals of being an officer. You learn the fundamentals of leading a platoon in uh, close combat circumstances. So towards the end of that, and it was very emphasized to us, like, you guys know you're going off
Right.
to serve, in the relative near future after you're complete with your training pipeline. So towards the end of the basic school, and this is something that might be a little bit different from other services, with the exceptions of pilots and lawyers now, and I can't really speak to those specifics because I'm not in that world anymore. But if you contract as an unrestricted ground officer, you go to TBS basically not knowing what your MOS is going to be like. And towards the end of it, they basically have you a dream sheet saying, okay, now, first is I want to be a logistics officer, second, I want to be a communications officer, and so on and so forth. And then a few weeks later, okay, this is what your MOS is going to be, right? So
Oh,
the
wow.
emphasis is really, the emphasis going in is basically saying, like, you join because you want to serve as a Marine officer, not because you want to be an infantry officer or a logistics officer, or communications officer. Like, first, you are a Marine officer. I was fortunate, I suppose, in that I got my first choice. So I
Very fortunate.
had, yeah, also there were a lot of slots. So, I was fortunate to
Well,
want
like
something where they needed a lot of people.
communications, because I know
So
you sort of speaking of books of like The Giver, it's like you're gonna get what we give you. This will be this is
that's
your path.
basically it. It's actually, I liked that book when I was a kid. So that's actually a very common, that's a good analogy because it is like a big old ceremony and they just tell you what you're, it's like Asher. Um, yeah. And nobody was the receiver memory. So if I remember correctly. Um, so um, I put communications officer first. I had a technical degree. I had a bachelor's degree in physics, and I found out that was pretty much like your warrant got signed if they found out you had a engineering or science degree, you're going to be a commo. Um, so worked out all the same. And then had that was followed up with 6 months of communications officer school, which is a very long MOS school. At the time, it was also in Quantico, Virginia, where the TBS, where the base was. Um, and I graduated comm officer school in December of 2007. And
Mm.
towards the very end of comm school, um, one of the instructors pulled several of us aside and said, "Okay, guys, you are all going to Marine Wing Communications Squadron 38, which is at Marine Corps Base, or sorry, Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, California, San Diego, California." It's like, hey, you guys are all going to Comm Squadron 38. One of their companies is deploying in January, so in a month away, and the other company back, and we need three of you to get assigned to this company that's deploying. So, what are your thoughts on this? And um, I said to the instructor, in my case, sir, I'm single. All my stuff fits in the back of my compact car. I just need to know if I should be getting a lease in San Diego or if I should just manage to, hang out in a hotel until we deploy. That's pretty much all I care about knowing, right? And his response to me was, Ralph, the Marine Corps will always have a cot for you. So I knew that meant I was going to Iraq pretty soon afterwards. So went
Wow.
we graduated in middle of December. Went back to Indianapolis for Christmas with my parents, and then got on an airplane to San Diego, and we were in Iraq a month later. Um,
Wow. What was the I guess the sentiment because you said you did get to go home just before you left. What was the sort of the sentiments around with your family at that time, especially probably seeing what they were seeing on the news.
well, my mom did a great job of keeping her worries inside her.
Mm.
So, and he was, I'd been in the army, and he was very playing with me. He's like, Ralph, you have a lot of responsibility
Mm.
and you need to execute that well for you and for your Marines. Like, okay. Um, and then, yeah, and then I went to California, and then as our unit was having their send off, my actually my mom and two of my sisters flew out there as well for the
Wow,
send off. So that was kind of nice.
that's really nice. Out of curiosity, what did your dad do?
In the army, he was a military policeman.
Wonderful, great, really cool. No, I say, and I can kind of get that sort of similar sentiment in interviewing other veterans about, the mom suppressing how she really wants to feel. But I find that when the moms go around there, they're keeping an eye, facial recognition of like who's in charge here, who can I call and talk to if I need to find out information about my child.
Yep,
And it
that's
said, and it's definitely a lot more access to that information now, I say than back then, especially with as frequently as the deployments were happening. So take us to that piece now. So you've said goodbye to your family, and now you're heading off to your first deployment.
yeah. So by that point it was 2008. So and we were with the Air Wing. So the Air Wing was pretty much in a static position across
Mm,
Western Iraq, and so we were at Al Asad Air Base, which is a huge air base that was well, I suppose was, they aren't using it anymore, um, with a very large presence. And a I was a wire platoon commander, so wire being telephones, right? Telephone platoon commander, and my Marines were responsible for maintaining the telephone network used by Marine forces on that base. And then, in addition to that, I was a systems control watch officer, which essentially means you're a watch officer on the comm network, and if something's down, you're troubleshooting and leading the efforts. And
right.
Marines from whatever section is appropriate are going out and doing the work.
Now,
So
as a young new officer on your first deployment, again, you didn't even have time to really get your feet wet. Really, it was a graduate, say bye to the family, and head out the door. Did you have anybody that, feel free to take this time to shout out their name, but anybody that took you under their wing at that time, provide any sort of mentorship to you?
yes, it's terrible because I can't remember her name, but his name off the top of my head. I can picture his face, but I can't think of his name. Our company XO was an amazing guy, and he really took the responsibility for mentoring myself and the other newer lieutenants. And there was also, again, I can't remember his name, but there was a captain that worked in the G6,
Mm,
who was uh, who had actually been involuntarily recalled, if I remember correctly, for the deployment. And he did a great job in just talking through circumstances we were facing, in a way that he wasn't our CO, he wasn't our XO, right? Like he was just a guy that was working nearby that was happy to help. So I really appreciate what they did for us,
right, just having that
for
someone
myself and the
see.
other newer lieutenants there.
Right, having somebody seasoned to be able to help guide you all is so important, especially as someone that's young and new to that leadership position. I mean, sometimes they could put all the training they want and put us through all of that, and still find ourselves in challenging situations, having to make those tough decisions. And so, just out of curiosity too, did you end up at that time? I know they said you always provide you a cot. The Marine Corps gave you a cot for how many months?
We were in Iraq for 6 months, I believe. Yeah, that sounds about right. Because we got there in January and we were back by July, mid-July, I believe.
Oh, good. So you weren't involuntarily extended like the port that you were talking about.
No, no, Marine Corps did not do that to us. No.
Oh, that's good. So and we can circle back to it if you want, but I'd love to hear what that about that coming home was for you after 6 months.
I mean, it was great. My family, some of my family came out to San Diego, saw them. We had post-deployment leave, so a
Mm.
good portion of our unit was, kind of split to the winds for a while, and then just took some leave to see people I knew back in Indiana, and kind of get my affairs in order there in San Diego. Finding an apartment and things like that, and then just kind of get ready for return to the garrison life for at least a little bit.
And I ask that because when we talk about transition from active duty, I feel like we fail to look at the other periods of transition that we go through during our time in service, and some of them can be a deployment, right?
Mhm.
Especially if it's a combat deployment, and then that transition to garrison where either you get stuck behind a desk or things are just moving on and just seeing completely different worlds there.
Mhm.
Did you feel that transition period at all, or was it pretty
Uh,
smooth sailing for you?
no, it was fine. I mean, the biggest thing is that also now, I've been dating my now wife for about a year at that point, and so she also came out to San Diego. I'm really sure I remember that. Um, and and so now being able to travel back to Minnesota to see her. No, I mean the garrison life worked out was nice because I got a broader experience with new types or new platoons within comms. So when you're with a large comm unit in the Marine Corps, usually there's platoons for different types of comms. So like in that case, there was the wire telephone which I started with, and then there was a radio platoon, and then there was a data platoon. And so coming back, I got experience as the radio platoon commander and then the data platoon commander. Um, Data platoon was awesome in particular because had a lot of great Marines. They were really sharp and wanted to do innovative things. Had a great
Mhm.
group of staff NCOs that were working with me. That
I
was
didn't
pretty
know there
awesome.
was a place called I didn't know there was a platoon called data platoons. So I'm just trying to imagine what a data platoon should look like any other Marine, but particular I would say it's like Harry Potter's sorting hat when you match
Uh,
people with their particular jobs in the military. And
yeah,
then we first time you see everybody in civilian clothes, and then you're like, yeah, okay, it makes sense now.
yeah, there were definitely Marines who were very, very well suited for that. I mean, they're like I remember a couple corporals in particular. They just came up with an idea saying, "Hey, let's build a little comm lab inside our bay." It's kind of like your standard military open space
Right.
bay. Like, let's just build that, and then we can just do trade every day when we have downtime. Great. Like, this is the it was a dream to be that platoon commander. Then I was put into the operations officer and executive officer position for the company.
Mm,
So I was the OPSO XO for a while, and then got selected for an individual augment deployment to Afghanistan as a comm officer. And so I went to Afghanistan for 6 months. I was working on the NATO ISAF staff. Yeah, they're in Kandahar, the Regional Command South staff inside their
wow.
J6, which was a ton of fun actually because on my deployment to Iraq, I was in the standard platoon commander billet, and
Mhm.
then I was a first lieutenant, but I was now on a staff, and that was a first for me, and it was not your standard staff because there were roughly 10 officers and staff NCOs in it, but
Right.
there were 3 Americans, 4 Americans in there. I mean, it was mostly um, uh, allied officers and staff NCOs.
Horses.
So like
Wow.
I worked for a
Interesting.
British officer, a British major directly, and then our entire section worked for a British lieutenant colonel. So it was really cool at that young age to be working in a coalition international staff where you as an American are actually not the majority, much less you as a Marine.
Oh my God, they cover the office with the Union Jack and pictures of the Queen. That was definitely our
They
experience working with the British.
they had a lot of good tea. They had a lot of good
A
tea.
lot of
I'll
good
say that.
tea. And our guys are like, actually, we don't like tea. We prefer coffee. And I was like, oh my goodness, countering the stereotype here. But no, I think that that's really interesting, especially having that. I think you probably added a lot of value at that point, at that strategic staffer level, considering that you were boots on ground, actually, your first deployment. Also, that's not always the case, particularly when for some officers, especially nowadays, and you sort of we're not deploying like we were before. So I'd love to, just to the interest of time, sort of segue to the how many years total did you end up serving in the Marine Corps, and take us a little bit about when you decided it was time to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I commissioned 2006. I'm actually still in the reserves. So I'm at 18 years now. But
Hmm.
after Afghanistan, I had orders to go to recruiting duty. So back in Indiana. So I did 2 years in recruiting duty and then decided to transition into the civilian world. That was 2012. And so went back to school to get a graduate degree and then uh, moved to Minnesota. My wife grew up here, and so we wanted to settle down here. And then kind of began the long slog of being a reservist slash civilian. Since
What
then,
was that decision, I guess, for the for active duty, from going active into the reserves?
it was a bunch of things. I mean, mostly like I just had my fun. Like, and I had done a lot of fun, a lot of things. I was wanting to be able to have a little bit more stable personal life. At that point, you were gonna, if you stayed in the Marine Corps, it was not going to be a stable life by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. No, it's such a good point. But even for then, did you feel like since you were going one foot in, one foot out, the transition was a bit easier? Uh, Unlike what the horror stories we sort of hear from our other brothers and sisters in service.
Yeah, it definitely softened the blow, I would say. I mean, and I had not like the most noble reasons to stay in the reserves. Mostly, I didn't have a job, and so I needed health insurance and a little bit of income. And so I'm like, oh, I'll just do the
Nothing wrong
reserves.
with that.
Yeah, and this was before, Affordable Care Act made
Right.
healthcare much more affordable. So I'm like, okay, now I'll just do this for a couple years till I get a job, and kind of, and I just stayed around, and I've just been doing it
Right.
since then. And my motivations have really gone to like, hey, I love the camaraderie of being in the reserves, and
Mm.
that's where if somebody's transitioning, even if they don't have like a great taste in their mouth about the military, which I can certainly understand if they don't, but like, um, is to still consider the reserves because it's like the reserves, for better or worse, is like the military, but in small doses, you know. And so like you can
Yes.
hate your job Monday to Friday, but like, hey, you know what? This weekend I'm gonna go put on the uniform. I'm gonna do some things that are fun, maybe some stupid PowerPoints as well. But like, I get to break away from my regular life for a couple.
This is where I tease with the officers because I ever hear the officers complain about anything like PowerPoint, for example. I'm like, sir, ma'am, remember this as you move up the ranks, the power of the change. And they're like, oh, I'll never make it. And then you see them a few years later and they're still in and like, see, sir, ma'am, like you ended up sticking around longer than you thought you were. Start enacting that change. But no, I love it. 18 years. That's incredible. You're in the home stretch, the light at the end here. Unless you do decide to be like General Mattis and stay in for I don't know how many years it's been, but
Um,
yeah, so you could go on, 30 plus. But no, I'd love to hear your advice because sometimes, some of our listeners are going through the transition right now from active to civilian life or potentially reserves or guard. What would your advice be to them?
yeah. So first off, consider the reserves. Always something that to kind of keep some of that continuity. That's one piece. I mean, the biggest thing is that um, changing your mindset to understand that like you don't have a monitor anymore. So I don't know what the term would be for the Army or other services, but the monitor is basic in the Marine Corps is the officer or the staff NCO who directs you on your next assignment, right?
Hmm.
And for better or worse in the military, promotion and advancement, the rules of the game are pretty well known, right? Like
Right,
it's like it's you do these types of billets, you get this right score on your physical fitness test, like you do this, then the other thing, and those might not be easy. Like it's pretty easy to understand, and somebody will tell you what's next, but you don't have a monitor now. Like, and so you get to decide what is next for you. I see a
right,
lot of people um, who I talk to who are leaving the military, and they think that what they're able to do is very limited. Like they think either, oh, I was this MOS, so I need to find whatever the civilian equivalent is, or I can only go into project management or program management, or like the world is kind of your oyster now. Not all those things are gonna give you necessarily the financial security or the flexibility or the living location you might want, but like you get to make those choices. And so once you realize that, now it's a question of like backwards planning. Uh,
Right.
what do I want to be? What do I want to be, and what do I want to do? How constrained are those, and what are the steps I need to take to bring that about?
I'm so glad that you mentioned location too, because I can't tell you how many times that service members they're like, I'm not quite sure what I want to do yet. But they definitely know the jobs they don't want to do. And then they sort of say, I'm willing to go anywhere. And you're like, are you willing to go to Alaska? And like, well, no. What about Hawaii? No. So it's like you can't really just mass blast because there's so many people like yourself, veterans who are reaching back who want to help other those going through the transition right now. But you sort of have to take that time to have that talk with yourself, with your family, to narrow that scope down, right? So
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
think that very valuable advice. And this is where a great point about, again, like I said, give that shameless plug about your entrepreneurship start, because I find that entrepreneurship and just being an entrepreneur is something that is gaining increased interest from those
yeah,
going through transition.
yeah. So after I transitioned, I moved to Minnesota. I worked at General Mills, which is a food company. It's located here. Then I worked at Target. The retailer is located here. And then a few years ago, decided to start my own company in the same field I've been working. It's called Data Driven Supply Chain. It's a consulting firm that helps companies use artificial intelligence and data science to improve traditional supply chain questions like where should my facilities be, how much inventory should I carry, things like that. So
Hmm.
uh, company website just datadrivensupplychain.com. You can email me, Ralph at datadrivensupplychain.com. And the broader topic of veteran entrepreneurship, I think that um, veterans as a group, right? Like everybody, there's a lot of diversity of personalities and things like that within veterans. But as a group, I think that the skills that you're taught in the military translate well into entrepreneurship and small business ownership. Things like
Hmm.
self-reliance, things like strategic planning, things like detail-oriented planning. Like these are all things that matter a lot if you're running a business, and they're absolutely skills that we drill into service members even from the earliest days. So that's where I definitely would encourage people to think about that.
And you said datadrivensupply.com for your company.
Datadrivensupplychain.com.
Datadrivensupplychain.com. Thank you for sharing that. And I say that because I definitely want our listeners to reach out and engage with you later to ask questions about that leap. Because I was even told before starting a nonprofit, you got to be prepared to want to be the CEO and the logistics person and the accountant and the logistics. It's just like all these things that I was like, do any of that. But there's so many resources now for veterans that even state benefits, and then if you're a disabled veteran, even benefits there. Just a small business owner, there's all these incentives, even helping with business plan. That is as scary as it can be. I try to remind them there's like you said, mentioned swimming. You're like, I'm not a swimmer, but the near drowning experience that they put us through when we're going through training, we came out the other end, semi unscathed. And so we've gone through a lot harder things, right? And
Yeah,
even
and
look at you now.
mhm. Yeah, and it's great that you mentioned all those resources because I know in here in Minnesota, well, veteran-owned small business, tremendous amount of resources for how do you build a business plan? How do you access capital? How do you think about tax strategies? I mean, all sorts of business management things. There's resources there to help you out.
Yes, and I find that even for the veterans who didn't identify as veteran when they got out, they're one of the folks that you mentioned earlier that didn't want anything to do with the military, not even the reserves or guard afterwards. And they found they have testimony that when they decided to start a business, it was the veteran community that came back in full support. Even though they didn't know them from Adam, never served with them, not even the same branch, but they were the ones that were more likely to support, knowing that they were a veteran, that they did serve and to help their business out. So it was the veteran community that came together to really support them. And I think that there's a lot of power in that in the community that we're in. Oh, so there
Oh,
and yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. And I was gonna ask you about how you're serving beyond the uniform now, as you talked about, that's the bread and butter about Veteran Voices is talking about giving back. And I know you've been doing a lot of that. So I'd love to take this a bit more.
to, continuing to serve in the reserves, and also just there's a burgeoning number of veterans who are interested in the data analytics field, which I
Hmm.
work in, and so within kind of the Venn diagram of veterans versus analytics types, I mean, there's not a ton of overlap, and so like the people who are interested in it, uh, a fair number would come to me and just ask for advice on that, and so happy to guide them, just give advice to the extent that it's worthwhile and useful for them. you know,
It
uh,
definitely is. That mentorship piece is huge. And I find that even just for me knowing you now, and I come across service members or veterans who are trying potentially doing a career pivot. They could have been a medic, they could have been a military police officer in the military, like your dad. It's just like trying to change, and now they want to get into something with supply chain, with data, with numbers. I'm what they call a non-numbers person. I try to avoid numbers. I'll go the other direction. But knowing if I meet somebody who wants to get into that, to have you there is invaluable. So thank you for that.
no.
So I did want to ask too about, as we end up closing up about the mentorship piece. So as we talk about even now, I say that we go through different transitions and periods in this life. Your business is still fairly young, and just sort of the shout out to any of the mentors that potentially you've been reaching out or engaging with.
Yeah, so the biggest mentors I could say are Marines that I've served with, and so two names that I want to bring up is Colonel John Church. He's retired now. He was the commander of Third Civil Affairs Group when I was the communications officer there, and he was just 100% the example of what you would hope a servant leader in the military would be like. Very team oriented, very humble, very caring, mission oriented. Like he was very much, oriented towards, hey, making sure that you accomplish mission. But you could tell that he was, he truly cared about you, and he was 100% the most genuine person, inside and outside of the uniform. Langfeld, who was my command officer when I was on recruiting duty, who really helped shape a very action-oriented mindset in me. And helped sharpen that, which has helped me as a subsequent career.
I love that. And it's a big part with Veteran Voices. We talk about being able to pay it forward. And so I love that other fellow Marines are able to help you, and other veterans being able to reach back and share that knowledge. Because it is about, we find a lot easier to talk about the we as a team as opposed to the me and I when it comes to the military transition. And so I think that piece is important to know that when even as successful as we end up being, that we didn't do it alone. I mean, heck, I'm not even host of this podcast having done it myself. It was other veterans that, reached out to get me here. So again, just as we end up talking about the things that you're doing to serve beyond, are there any sort of veteran service organizations that you would like to give a shout out to?
Yeah, encourage too. So if you are a veteran interested in data analytics or anything like that, there's a LinkedIn group called Veterans in Data Science and Machine Learning, which is exactly that. And so that's a good place to learn whether you're already in the field or just interested in it. And just more broadly, I would encourage people to look into American Corporate Partners and some of the related organizations that have spun up since then. ACP was instrumental to my transition, and I would highly encourage seek them out as a protege or as a mentor.
Great shout out. And dear friend of mine, Leslie Coffey, is up there at American Corporate Partners. I have been fortunate to be as a mentee and a mentor. So I really appreciate that you shouted them out as an organization that helped you. And for those who don't know, American Corporate Partners, it helped those of you going through transition or even after the fact. I come across veterans from all different uh, age groups and eras that they're looking to match up with somebody who is on sort of the career path that they are wanting to go on. So they have access with CEOs, entrepreneurs, and it's just an incredible resource for you at no cost. So thank you for shouting them out. And I'd love to, do you have any sort of closing thoughts here as we as we unfortunately close our session, because I said I'm very good at going around 40, 45 minutes, but I know I could talk all day with so many of the veterans I have on the show.
Yeah, I would just say, yeah, that are in, as their next steps after service, or if they've been out a while and are thinking about what's next. The world's your oyster. You have a lot more to offer than maybe you think you do, and just understand people are in your corner. You don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to seek out veterans organizations, because people want to help you, but they won't know until you talk to them, basically. Uh,
Yes. And could you say your contact information again for our listeners who would like to reach you?
yeah, is that's probably the best to get me is just Ralph, Ralph, at datadrivensupplychain.com. Also, if you find me you can look me up on LinkedIn, Ralph Asher. I look pretty much like this in my picture. If you do send me a message, just say, hey, this is what you heard me on this podcast, so have some reference point. Uh, those are probably the easiest way.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ralph, again for joining me on Veteran Voices. Again, Veteran Voices is a podcast, part of the Supply Chain Now family of programming. We are a podcast that loves to interview veterans who are serving beyond the uniform and doing incredible work, like Ralph Asher here, who's not only a Marine Corps a veteran, someone who's also a reservist, but also a veteranpreneur. And so please, he is definitely more of numbers person than I am. So reach out to him with all your questions regarding that and data and supply chain. Again, we here at Veteran Voices, as we love to say, do good, pay it forward, and be the change that's needed. Again, I'm Mary Kate Soliva, your host here at Veteran Voices, and I hope to see you here next time. Take care.